Hi YouTube, I'm Darren George. Well, it's mid-December and here in the UK it's grey, it's a cloudy day, the rain's coming down and it's miserable. With Christmas just around the corner, I wonder if one or two folks out there might be getting new Chinese Elm Bonsai. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how to keep these charming little guys healthy and happy until the spring, when the growing season begins again and all the fun jobs need to be done. I think there are three things that we need to do in order to guarantee the success of a new Chinese Elm Bonsai. First, it's important to have a good look at the tree, get to know how healthy is it, how's it been doing up till now. This information might give us some clues about how to keep it happy and healthy until the spring. The next thing that we need to think about is where should we keep the tree until the growing season comes around. And finally, the last thing that will need to be considered is watering the tree. Let's have a look at this tree first then. So, the first thing to notice is it's got plenty of foliage, the crown's quite full, the leaves are a nice even green colour, the foliage on the branches is reasonably close together, it's not too spread out. The branches are looking a little bit leggy, so we've got quite a long distance from the trunk until we start to get to the foliage. What's happened is this tree's been sat in the nursery, and as it's been grown on, it's been trimmed over. So repeatedly, any growth that pops up has been cut back to this silhouette that we've got here. And so what that's created is plenty of foliage on the outside and some sparsity in the middle. Another factor would be that the leaves on the outside will create shade underneath, and so any leaves that were present here have turned yellow and dropped off. That's a perfectly natural thing to happen. The tree senses that the leaves on the inside that are shaded out, it senses that they're not receiving enough light, so it sucks the goodness from those leaves on the inside and reinvests it on growth on the outside, searching for the light. So the foliage is looking quite nice on this one. I'm quite happy with it. This is healthy foliage. Perhaps could be a little greener, but it's fine. Okay, so let's have a closer look at the soil. On the surface we've got a gravelly substance that's quite loose, and we're able to push it back, revealing this soil that looks a bit more familiar. It looks like potting compost or plain old earth. If we press it, there's a sponginess to it. That tells me that these stones aren't present throughout the pot. They are simply a top dressing to top up the pot. The sponginess also indicates that there's probably quite a lot of root through the soil. This tells us that this tree is probably coming up for a repot. As the pot fills with roots, there's less and less room for the roots to grow, and there's also less and less room for water to penetrate the soil. Even though this tree probably needs to be repotted, it's not the best time of year to be doing it. We'll come to that in the spring. The soil that we've got underneath looks quite dense. This isn't ideal soil for growing bonsai in. What the roots need is plenty of air passing through the soil, and the roots also need good drainage, and this dense soil isn't the best growing medium to achieve that. Again, we'll address that when we come to repotting. we'll use a more open substrate that will encourage strong, healthy roots and also minimise the chance of overwatering. So overall then, this tree is looking reasonably good. The foliage is great for a newly purchased Chinese elm bonsai. The soil needs a bit of work, but we're not surprised. This is pretty standard stuff and we'll address that in the spring. So the foliage on this Chinese elm is looking quite sparse. The branches are very leggy. There's quite long distances till you get to the leaves. The leaves are reasonably well spaced. There's also quite a lot of stuff that looks like it's died back here and there with no leaves. It's quite crusty and falls off easily. The foliage on this tree is telling us that the tree isn't in the best of health. The sparsity of the leaves is a pretty good indication that the roots of the tree aren't happy. The amount of foliage a tree can support is dictated by the health of the root system. The healthier the roots, the more water and nutrients can be taken up by the tree, and the more leaves can be sustained. If we have sparse foliage such as this, it tells us that the roots aren't working as well as perhaps they could be. The sparsity of the foliage also points to the tree perhaps trying to tell us that it's not getting enough sunlight. If a tree isn't getting enough sunlight, what it'll do is it will suck the nutrients out of foliage near the trunk and reinvest the nutrients into growth further and further away from the trunk, searching for the best sunlight so that it can continue to thrive and survive. If a tree is getting enough nutrients from the roots and is getting enough sunlight from above, we'd expect plenty of leaves close in, the leaves to be quite nice and tight and close together and have good density to the foliage. We wouldn't have these died back twigs. It'd all be nice and much more bushy. Okay, so if we move in close and let's check out the soil of this tree. So there's quite a lot of moss on the surface. As we push the moss back, we reveal this uniform looking earth that's possibly potting compost, or maybe it's plain old earth, and this is typical stuff. It's quite standard for trees to be planted in this material and then shipped to be sold. The trouble is, this material is very dense. It doesn't allow water to easily penetrate, and it doesn't allow air to easily penetrate. So the chances are the root system of this tree isn't as healthy as it could be, and we may have drainage issues when we come to water, which we'll look at shortly. An important thing to take into account when you've got a new bonsai tree, particularly Chinese elms or other imported trees that have come from countries that have a different climate to where you live, in my case the UK, it's important to think about where you keep the tree. In the case of Chinese elms, they're much easier to keep happy and healthy if you keep them outside year round. When you keep your Chinese elm outdoors, it's easier to ensure that the tree gets plenty of light during the growing season. It's also important that the tree gets rest over winter and is allowed the cold temperatures that it requires in order to go into dormancy. In this country, the UK, Chinese elms are deciduous. That means in the autumn the trees will drop their leaves and go dormant over winter until the longer days and the warmer temperatures arrive in the spring. As you can see, these trees are still in leaf even though it's December, and that's because they've probably been fairly recently imported into the country from a place that has a very different climate to the UK. Because these trees aren't used to the UK winters, we need to give extra careful thought to where we keep the tree. Even though Chinese elms are easier to keep healthy outdoors, it's important that we take into account the conditions that the tree has been used to before it was imported into this country. That means that it's not a good idea to take this tree and let it live outside immediately. The tree's probably going to need a couple of UK winters before the tree realises that it's actually better to drop its leaves and go dormant in the winter. Because these trees aren't yet used to the cold conditions that we get, what I will be doing with them in the winter is I will be storing them in a greenhouse. The greenhouse ensures that the trees don't get excessively wet in all the rain that we have, and also it provides shelter from cold, drying winds. What the greenhouse doesn't do is prevent freezing. The temperatures overnight will still drop pretty low in the greenhouse, admittedly not perhaps as low as outside of the greenhouse, but still low enough for the water inside to freeze. But because the trees are sheltered from the wind, this is less of a problem. It's also important to note that I took these trees into my garden well before we got the first frosts. So the trees have experienced a gradual decrease in temperatures as the autumns progressed through to the winter. If you're wondering where you should keep your trees and you have the option to keep the tree outside, it's probably still worth considering keeping the tree in a cool indoors location if you don't have access to a greenhouse. Such places as an unheated garage, a shed if it's got a window, or like I'm in here, a conservatory that gets plenty of light. All of these options will be fine. It's best not to keep your tree near a radiator, or if you can avoid it, away from drafts. I don't know very much at all about keeping trees alive indoors. I keep all mine outdoors. I'm fortunate to have a garden, so I will provide a link to an excellent YouTube video that goes into great detail about how to keep trees alive indoors if that's the route that you choose. This is where I keep all of my sensitive projects, things like cuttings and air layers and emergency repots. So I'll keep these trees in here with all my other sensitive projects. It's just a cheap plastic pop-up greenhouse. It was actually given to me, so it didn't cost me anything. During the day I open the doors to ensure some fresh air can pass through, prevent any fungal issues. And then in the evening or on particularly windy days I will shut the doors, keep everything nice and snug. Coming up in part 2, we'll talk about watering your new Chinese elm bonsai.